Intel absolutely got hammered last week on what I would call a very decent earnings report. And I say decent because they hit their numbers. Okay. Yeah. So anytime you deliver revenue and you deliver profit at the street's expectation, it's very hard to say anything but it was a decent quarter.
Yeah.
But Intel has had this just crazy run of unequaled criticism and skepticism on the streets. It doesn't really seem to matter what the company does. In Q1 and Q2 of the fiscal year, it blew out the data-centric numbers, had huge server numbers pushed forward, and the street still was punitive. The company, without question, has had turnover. It had CEO turnover. It had issues with turnover now in its CTO and its technology leader of the company. It had delays last quarter that it announced on 7 nanometers that brought it down, even though its numbers last quarter were great. And this quarter is another quarter. It's kind of funny, Pat. I looked at it the opposite. It seems the company executed pretty well given the difficult circumstances. You got to remember, we had massive supply chain disruptions this year. We had coronavirus this year bring down China. You had a little bit of a bump that came from the CPU demand, but you had delays as they were in the middle of a process turnover anyway, right? As the company was moving to Tiger Lake in its 10 nanometer process for its CPUs. And this quarter, it actually delivered a little bit better than expected in terms of volume on Tiger Lake as 10 nanometer. The CPU business grew, albeit only 1%, which was hardly enough to get anybody excited. But what the real story was here is the data-centric business that had been a rock star the last 2 quarters got plowed. I think it was over 30% down. And the street was super unforgiving. The stock gave up, I think, over 10% that day. And I think now AMD got an upgrade today, another upgrade, and the stock, even though our market is getting hammered this morning, has actually been up. AMD has been up, and it's been a lot of which is because I think with Intel, it being the biggest, being the incumbent, and having had the troubles it's had over the last year, Pat, is perfection is the only thing that's going to please the street. So even though AMD's trading at like 80 times or 100, I think 100 something times earnings, and NVIDIA's at 80 something times earnings, and Intel's like a quarter of that, nobody cares. Everybody is basically saying if Intel does one thing wrong, we're just not going to forgive it for these mistakes. So, like I said, I think Intel's got a lot of work. They're going to have to continue to hit. They're going to need to be more accurate and precise. They're operating their process, and got to get data-centric back on track. What were your thoughts on the earnings?
So I'm going to take what you said and take it a step further. I've been in and around Intel for 30 years. I was their customer, I was their competitor, and now I analyze them. And I'm going to not necessarily create a new law here, but I'm going to talk about one, and that is Newton's law of the stock market. The same rocket ship that got it up there is pressing against it. So let's think about this. People were going around Intel stock because they were completely dominating. They had flawless execution for a decade, and they got people hooked on this notion that a smaller geometry, the distance between transistors, the nanometers, the lower one would win everything. So now we're in where Intel isn't flawlessly executing. So think about the financial analysts who put their credibility on the line and made fun of companies like AMD and NVIDIA, right? So that same propulsion system that got it up there is now taking it down. And I don't think it's flawless execution, Daniel. I think it's going to be a combination of time and flawless execution. I feel like there's this half-life, which is, it played against companies like AMD where nobody believed a single word AMD said. By the way, I was a huge skeptic, okay, until they delivered millions of a part and made a lot of money on it, right? And then I became a lot more of a believer. I think Intel is going to have to show that they're directly competing with NVIDIA in graphics, gaming graphics, and machine learning training. Okay. And they're going to have to improve on their execution. I hope everybody's buying into the nanometer game that, by the way, Intel created. 10 from Intel and 7 from TSMC are very similar in terms of density and performance. In fact, if I look at what Intel actually has higher transistor performance, but it doesn't matter. It took 25 years to train people. And I'm not going to say it's going to take 25 years to untrain people, but right now there's a lot of forces that are going against Intel.
Yeah, I think you make a great point. First of all, your tech know-how is good. A lot of people don't realize that 10 nanometer plus that came with Tiger Lake is very much the match for the 7 nanometer that AMD is touting with TSMC. And that makes it look on paper, and it's a very marketable thing that Intel's further behind. But when Intel 7 nanometer comes out, it would actually leapfrog AMD's current 7, but now AMD is pushing for 5. So you can see this race. But I actually think your best point in your analysis there, Pat, is that the company is going to be looked at very scrupulously for, can it start to match and line up, right? You have NVIDIA making the ARM move. That's big. A lot of people are weighing heavily and putting bets behind NVIDIA, which is a very loved Wall Street gem right now, right? People just feel that company's on the right track, and $1 trillion valuation could be in its future. And now it has all this intellectual property for CPU chips that it didn't have before. There's a lot of weight against the company there. And then, of course, Lisa Su and AMD have been very consistent in execution. The street is given tremendous times earnings in terms of the value of the stock, but it's because it's gone in the right direction, though. I mean, given what you dealt with your tenure at AMD, totally different company, executing at a whole nother level, and has consistently put out products that people like. Having said all that, Intel still has 90+% of the server market. It still has the biggest share of the CPU market. And it's still a brand that your average consumer walks into a Best Buy or goes online, orders a CPU, and they say, what do you want? Now, I'm not talking about a gamer. I'm not talking about a graphics designer. I'm talking about the average productivity or home PC. Yeah. People say, I want Intel. Intel still has that. And the best thing the company can do is make sure over the next few years, it doesn't lose that.